Who wouldn't love to only shoot in perfect light all the time? But let's face it, that's just not realistic, and sooner or later you will be confronted with harsh and unforgiving sunlight. But what if you simply don't want to stop shooting yet? Does it mean you're doomed to end up with bad images? Not if you know the right tricks. So in this video I will share a few powerful techniques with you that will help you to create stunning images even in the most tricky lighting conditions. And the best part? Your photos might not even look like they were taken in harsh light at all. I'm Wegener, and for over 20 years I've dedicated myself to capturing unique bird photos and videos and helping others just like you to create your own masterpieces. What makes an image look like it was taken in harsh light to our eyes is not necessarily the intensity of the light, but rather the existence of strong contrast in the images, consisting of almost blown out highlights and strong dark shadows. And this is often also accompanied by a somewhat washed out look. Whenever we see these problematic elements in a photo, our brains tell us that the image was probably taken in less than ideal lighting conditions. And it probably was, but we can fix that. So our goal is to lessen the impact of these troubled elements in our images through proper shooting techniques in the field and a few clever editing tricks, both of which I will show you now. Since we're dealing with a lot of light shining onto our subjects, we should usually be fine by using a quite low ISO, ideally below 800. That should still give us plenty of shutter speed and also the best possible image quality. On top of that, I would also suggest to not stop down too much and take large bursts of photos in case we're dealing with heat haze. By taking these large bursts, we can still ensure that we get a few sharp images, even if the majority of our images we're taking is soft. So a great setting for a bright sunny day, for instance, would be a 2000th of a second, f7.1 or f8 and ISO 800 or below. That should give us fantastic image quality and enough shutter speed to freeze most action. Because we're dealing with such strong light, we need to be mindful of not blowing out the brightest areas on our subjects and losing all the detail. And one great way of doing this is obviously to watch the histogram and make sure that we have a little bit of a gap on the right hand side. But another great way of ensuring that we're not blowing out the highlights is to enable the highlight alert or blinkies on the back of our cameras. And if we turn this on, we will now visually see the areas that are either blown out or on the verge of blowing out, and then can either increase the shutter speed or maybe dial in negative exposure compensation to ensure that we're not blowing out these areas. And if you're a Canon shooter, you could also turn something on that is called highlight tone priority. And this even works with RAW files. It basically gives you a bit more leeway in the highlights and maintains the details in the highlights better. The only downside with it is that it increases the noise in the shadows a little bit, so I don't use it all the time. But if you're in a very bright scene and worried about blowing out some highlights, turning that on can definitely help you. When we're trying to not blow out the brightest areas, especially in strong light, we often end up underexposing our images. But this is something that we can correct when we're doing the RAW conversion during the editing process by brightening the overall image and trying to also bring back more details in the shadows and into the highlight, basically stretching out the dynamic range of our RAW file. Oftentimes the balance between our subject and the background can also be thrown out when dealing with harsh light. Because if we have a bright subject and a darker background, we actually have to underexpose so much to not blow out our subject, but then that makes the background unnaturally dark and the whole image looks very contrasty and out of balance. So by lightening the background and darkening the bird, we can return some of that natural balance like what we would see with our own eyes and get a much more pleasant overall and less contrasty and aggressive looking image. The biggest giveaway that we're shooting in strong sunlight is the existence of harsh shadows on or under our subject because the sun is so high in the sky. So one of our main goals in the field is to position ourselves in the best way possible, usually with the sun right behind us, to eliminate as many of the shadows as possible on our subjects. The more the light is coming from the side, for instance, the more aggressive and strong these shadows will appear. What I also like to do when dealing with harsh light, even though it's kind of cheating, is to look for a bit of shade or maybe wait for a cloud to come overhead and give me like 30 seconds of less harsh light to take a few images. Something that I love to create, and you see in a lot of my images, is to have a darker subject and a brighter background. And having bright sunny conditions with a bit of shade are actually perfect to create that kind of scenario. If you can find yourself with a subject in the shade, but then have a brighter sunny background behind it, it can give you a beautiful effect in your images, as long as the shade isn't too dark and your background is too bright. If you try this effect in the middle of a day, it might not really work because the difference in dynamic range between your subject and the background is just too large. But what you can do sometimes then is, instead of trying to shoot into a sort of very bright distant background, maybe stand up or look around and see if you can find a slightly darker background behind your subject, and then you might be able to expose for your subject and the background again in the one exposure, and then you can get some beautiful looking images. But of course, we don't always have the luxury of finding shade, and after all, this is a video about shooting in harsh light and not in shade, so let's move on. What can definitely help when dealing with harsher lighting conditions is to pick our locations wisely and go to areas where the light can actually play to our advantage rather than limiting us. For instance, I would avoid going into dark forests where we have a lot of mottled light, and I would rather go to like a beach with bright sand, maybe a snowy area, or even water. Anything that kind of reflects the sunlight onto the ground and then back onto our subject. And these natural reflectors can often help us to shoot much longer because the bright sand reflects onto the bottom of a shorebird, for instance, and lights it up nicely. For instance, if we're shooting a sandpiper on a black rock, in harsh light, the image will look a lot worse than shooting the same bird at the same time on a nice and bright sandy beach. What we've learned throughout this video so far is that harsh sunlight in our images mainly shows up in 4 kind of unwanted ways. We have too bright and blown out highlights, we have too dark and strong shadows on our subjects, we have underexposed raw files, and then we also have raw files that are kind of washed out with too dark backgrounds because we had to underexpose them so much. And this is where editing comes in for me, because we can basically lessen or reverse the impact of all these elements and create images that look much better and look like they were taken in a much nicer light than they actually were. Especially working on the shadows and lessening their impact and removing parts of the shadows can have a profound impact on the final images. And I love nothing more than taking a below average RAW file that doesn't look like anything and turning it into a stunner. The first step when we edit our images is always the RAW conversion. And with images taken in harsh light, this is particularly important because we need to stretch out all the dynamic range available in our images. And first I do that by selecting one of my PROSETS to give me a great starting point and great colors right off the bat. And from there I try to make the image as bright as possible, and then aggressively pull back the highlight slider to bring back as many details as possible into those highlights. And from there I slightly adjust the shadows, even though I'm always very careful with the shadow slider, because you might feel like in an image with strong shadows you should lift the shadows, but that often only makes the image washed out without actually helping us in the shadows. So I only increase the shadows slightly to bring back a little bit more detail, but I'll work on them later with a special trick, and I don't want to affect them too much during the RAW conversion. So now we have a great balance in our image and nice colors already, but we're still confronted with quite dark and unpleasant to look at shadows, which also signal to our brains that the image was taken in harsh light. So we now need to lessen the impact of these shadows. And my go-to technique here is something that I discovered many years ago while playing around in Photoshop. You can do this in Lightroom as well, but the execution overall is a little bit easier in Photoshop. So what I like to do is to use the clone tool or the clone stamp, set it to 30 to 50% opacity, and then sample one of the brighter areas on our subject, and then clone that over the dark shadow areas. This is actually really easy to do and can have a massive impact on our images. Now we don't want to overdo it because then it looks fake, and we do need some shadows on our subject to give it that depth, but at the same time lessening the impact of the dark shadows can give the overall image a much better feel and make the final image look like it was taken in beautiful light rather than in strong harsh sunlight. All we need to do to execute this technique in Photoshop is to open our image and then create a new empty layer by pressing the little plus icon on the bottom right hand side, and then we want to clone on that empty layer. But in order to be able to do that, we need to make sure that on the top of Photoshop, it's set to either current and below or sample from all layers. Otherwise, we can't clone on our empty layer. And the next step is to make a selection of our subject so that we are not brushing onto the background. And from here, we bring up the clone tool by pressing the S button on our keyboard. And then we set that to anywhere between 30 to 50% opacity. You'll have to play around with that a bit to find out what looks natural. And then also we set it to 0% hardness so it all blends in nicely. And then we need to sample a nice bright area on our subject that we want to clone from that has a similar texture to the area that we're cloning to. So for instance, if I'm working on the bird's chest, I'm also sampling from the bird's chest. And then we hold down the Option Alt key, select that area, and then simply brush it over the dark shadow in 1 or 2 strokes. And in no time, we have an image with a lessened impact of the shadow and a beautiful overall look. And this technique works so much better than trying to lighten the shadows with a curve or brighten it somehow with the shadow slider. None of this works as well. It's simply just slightly cloning over it and blending it in perfectly. And in this wood swallow example from my Photoshop masterclass, you can see how we turn a dark, underexposed, washed out RAW file into a beautiful, vibrant image that doesn't look like it was taken in such bad light, because we remove the shadows on the branch and we also remove the shadows on the birds, just giving them a much nicer overall feel and balance. And if you've done some cloning and you feel like you've overdone it, you can either lower the opacity on that empty layer to bring back some of the shadows, or you can create a layer mask and then brush back in some more of the shadows to give it the balance that you're after. Crucial tricks and techniques like I've just shown you is also what I teach you step by step and in easy to follow chapters in my next generation Photoshop and Lightroom masterclasses. In there, you will learn with ease how to transform your own RAW files into true masterpieces, even if the light was less than ideal. But you won't just be watching. I'm also providing you with my own RAW files so you can edit step by step right alongside me. And if you're not sure whether my masterclasses are the right fit for you or worth it, check out some of the amazing reviews I've already received from many happy people who have helped to transform their own editing lives. So if you want to turn editing from a frustrating chore where you don't really know what to do to your RAW files to a rewarding experience where you know exactly how to transform your own RAW files into masterpieces, then I would recommend that you check out my Lightroom and Next Generation Photoshop masterclasses down there in the description. I know they will help you a lot. Now we've talked so much about avoiding harsh sunlight or how to deal with it and removing shadows, for instance, that I also wanted to remind you that harsh sunlight can also present beautiful opportunities. In particular, if we're dealing with a dark background and a lot of light on our subjects. In these cases, we can create some beautiful images where the subject truly stands out and the background is nice and dark. And this can work with the sunlight on the subject and then having a dark background, but it can also work the other way around. One morning I was sitting in my backyard photographing kookaburras and the sun started to kind of wander directly into my lens element and all the images kind of looked weird and washed out and I wasn't sure what to do. And then I noticed how the kookaburra had a very bright outline from the bright sunlight that was right behind it. So then I thought, why don't I underexpose dramatically now, trying to only capture the outline of the bird and the perch? And this actually came up a treat and gave me a very unique looking image in quite harsh light, but it actually just created this super interesting effect of the outline of the bird. So while harsh sunlight is not necessarily something we would like to find ourselves in all the time, it definitely presents us with some unique challenges, but also some great opportunities. And if you follow some of the techniques from this video and also the editing tricks that I've shown you, you will actually be able to take images in harsh light, but then get final images that look like they were taken in much better light and giving you a beautiful overall look and feel, even when the conditions at the time were less than ideal. And now I'd love to hear from all of you guys. What were your main struggles with shooting in harsh light? Have you found some techniques that maybe help all of us to get even better results? Let me know down there in these comments. Also give me a thumbs up for the video, check out my masterclasses, and hit that subscribe button, and I will see you guys in another video very soon. Bye!